There is a recurring pattern in world history, one that has dismantled three global superpowers over the last 5 centuries. It is a sequence so consistent, so mathematically predictable, that historians can now identify each stage with almost clinical precision. What is unsettling is that, in 2025, the United States is moving through this same sequence step by step, decision by decision, as if following a script written long before this nation existed. This isn't theory, it's precedent. In 1590, Spain reigned as the wealthiest empire on earth. They commanded half the world's gold and silver, dominated global military power, and issued a currency accepted across continents. Yet within 80 years, they were bankrupt, a faded empire that never regained global relevance. In 1914, the British Empire controlled the largest territory in human history. Their currency, the pound sterling, was the world's reserve currency. Their navy ruled the seas, but within 4 decades, the empire collapsed, the currency weakened, and Britain became a subordinate power aligned behind the rising United States. And in 1991, the Soviet Union, one of the 2 dominant superpowers, armed with nuclear weapons and vast geopolitical influence, ceased to exist. Not from war, but from economic implosion. It took just 900 days for the USSR to unravel completely. 3 superpowers, 3 collapses, 1 identical sequence of decline. And here is the warning. The United States has already completed 5 of the 7 historical stages that precede collapse. We are not approaching the pattern. We are already inside it. Before breaking down these stages, we must understand what imperial collapse truly looks like. Not in textbooks, but in reality, as lived by the nations that experienced it. Collapse does not begin with invasion or military defeat. It begins quietly with economic exhaustion. A superpower expands beyond its ability to sustain itself. It builds military bases around the world, fights costly wars, makes vast promises, and accumulates debts it can never repay. At first, the veneer of strength remains intact. The currency still circulates, the military still functions, and the government still speaks confidently. But beneath the surface, the foundation weakens. Resources are misallocated. Productive capacity shrinks. The brightest minds leave. The nation becomes a consumer of foreign goods and a producer of debt. Then acceleration begins. Allies hedge their bets. Enemies test boundaries. Trade partners diversify. The global reserve currency begins losing its privileged status. The strengths that once fueled dominance become liabilities. A once trusted currency starts returning home as foreign nations reduce their dependence. A globally stretched military becomes financially unsustainable. A government's promises begin to ring hollow. Spain went through this. Britain went through this. The Soviet Union went through this. And in every case, they believed they were immune to the consequences of their own actions. Spain was the template for all future imperial collapse. After the discovery of the Americas in 1492, the Spanish Empire seized control of the richest gold and silver deposits ever found. By 1550, ships carried an astonishing 200 tons of silver to Spain every year. By 1600, this number exceeded 400 tons annually. Spanish silver underpinned global trade. Its currency functioned as the world's reserve currency. It was the first time in history that one nation effectively controlled the world's money supply. And this is where the pattern begins. Stage 1. Military overextension. Flush with wealth, King Philip II launched wars across 4 continents against France, England, the Ottoman Empire, Italian states, and rebellious territories in the Netherlands. Spain's military footprint stretched from Europe to the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Half of Spain's revenue went to maintaining its military, and still, the spending was insufficient. Costs spiraled beyond control. Stage 2. Currency debasement. Unable to fund its commitments through taxation, the Spanish crown began debasing its silver coins by mixing them with copper. What began as a subtle adjustment soon became blatant manipulation. Coins that were meant to be pure silver contained 25%, 10%, then nearly zero real silver content. Inflation surged as confidence in the currency evaporated. Stage 3. The debt spiral. As revenues dwindled and military costs rose, Spain relied on endless borrowing from European bankers. When it could no longer service these debts, it defaulted 4 times in 40 years. Each default weakened its credibility, increased borrowing costs, and accelerated the decline. Stage 4. Collapse of productive capacity. Paradoxically, the vast influx of silver destroyed Spain's economy. With easy wealth flowing in, Spaniards stopped producing. Agriculture stagnated. Manufacturing collapsed. The nobility considered productive labor beneath them. Spain imported nearly everything. Its wealth simply passed through the country and right back out. When silver production declined, the economy imploded. Stage 5. Social decay. Crime rose. Beggars filled the streets. Skilled workers emigrated to more vibrant economies. Territories revolted. The empire withered from within. By the mid-1600s, Spain was no longer a superpower. By 1700, it was a hollow empire. Today, it is a respected but regionally limited nation, a former hegemon living in the shadow of its past. Case Study 2. Britain, the empire on which the sun never set. Britain dominated the world, militarily, economically, and financially. But the empire was already fragile. Stage 1. Military overextension, with commitments in India, Africa, the Middle East, the Pacific, and beyond. Britain was stretched thin. When World War I erupted, Britain faced a disastrous choice. Conserve resources or enter a continent-wide conflict. They chose war, and the cost shattered the empire's finances. Stage 2. Currency damage and overvaluation. The pound sterling, the world's reserve currency, was backed by gold, but war drained Britain's gold reserves. To maintain prestige, Britain returned to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war rate over, valuing the pound and crippling exports. Unemployment soared. Manufacturing declined. Domestic industry suffered permanent damage. Stage 3. Unmanageable debt. World War II sealed Britain's fate. Costs exceeded $120 billion in modern value. The country borrowed heavily from the US and Canada, emerging victorious but financially broken. Stage 4. Loss of empire. Within 2 decades, Britain relinquished India, Africa, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. The empire evaporated. Stage 5. Currency decline. The pound fell relentlessly, transitioning from dominant global currency to a regional one. Britain retained prestige and Security Council seat, nuclear arsenal, symbolic influence, but the era of empire was over. By the mid-20th century, the world witnessed the rise of another superpower, the Soviet Union. Unlike Spain or Britain, the USSR was not built on global trade or colonial territories, but on ideological ambition, central planning, and massive military expansion. Yet, despite the different structure, the outcome followed the same familiar trajectory. The Soviet Union moved through the same stages of imperial decline, revealing once again that it is the pattern, not the ideology of the empire, that ultimately determines its fate. After World War II, the USSR emerged as a dominant military force. It controlled Eastern Europe, built an enormous military machine, pioneered space exploration, and proclaimed itself the future of human civilization. But as with previous empires, beneath the appearance of strength lay profound structural weaknesses. The Soviet Union's collapse was not a sudden surprise. It was the mathematically inevitable result of decades of systemic imbalance. The Soviet Empire was vast, not geographically like Britain's, but strategically. To compete with the United States, the USSR maintained an enormous military footprint. Up to 5 million troops, the world's largest tank force, thousands of nuclear warheads, military advisors in dozens of countries, financial support for client states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The USSR spent 15 to 20% of its GDP on the military, 3 times the US share. But unlike the US, the Soviet economy lacked the strength and efficiency to sustain such spending. Where Britain bankrupted itself through global wars, the USSR bankrupted itself through endless military commitments, proxy conflicts, and ideological obligations. Afghanistan, for example, was a quagmire that drained resources, morale, and international legitimacy. This was the same stage Spain and Britain had faced but amplified. The Soviet economic model was fundamentally flawed. Central planning inhibited innovation, discouraged productivity, and rewarded obedience over efficiency. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy had stopped growing in any meaningful way. Output numbers were inflated to satisfy political targets. Factories produced vast quantities of inferior goods that nobody wanted. The agricultural sector was so dysfunctional that the USSR, home to some of the richest farmland on earth, was forced to import grain. Oil revenue masked deeper structural failures. As long as energy prices remained high, The USSR could finance its military and maintain its ideological influence abroad. But when oil prices dropped in the 1980s, the facade collapsed. Without energy income, there was no functioning economy beneath it. The ruble was not a true currency. It was strictly internal, non-convertible, distrusted, and artificially priced by the government. Soviet citizens preferred dollars, gold, or even barter. The black market became more efficient than the state economy. When global oil prices fell, foreign reserves dwindled. The USSR had to spend gold real money to acquire foreign goods, because no nation accepted rubles. This marked the same predictable decline seen in Spain's debased silver and Britain's post-war pound. The currency loses power long before an empire falls. By 1989, the financial foundation of Soviet power had crumbled. Eastern Europe revolted. The Berlin Wall fell. Satellite states defected. Soviet influence evaporated. The USSR could not respond. It was financially finished. Just as Spain lost Portugal and the Netherlands, and Britain lost India and Africa, the Soviet Union lost the territories that underpinned its geopolitical reach. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. 15 new nations emerged overnight. The superpower that once rivaled the United States dissolved peacefully, not through war, but through economic implosion and political dysfunction. It took just 900 days from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the collapse of the entire Soviet state. This is what imperial decline looks like when it reaches the final stage: sudden, irreversible, and dramatic. 3 empires, 3 collapses. One sequence. Spain, Britain. The Soviet Union. Different cultures, eras, technologies, and political systems. Yet the same outcome every time. The uncomfortable truth is that the United States is now advancing through the same 7 historical stages, not metaphorically, literally. Stage 4, stage, metric 4, metric. The US is replicating the decisions and structural failures of its predecessors. And here is the alarming part. America has already completed 5 of the 7 stages, not approaching them, not flirting with them. Inside them. Below is how each stage manifests today. The U.S. military footprint is unprecedented. 750-plus bases in over 80 countries, troops deployed in more than 150 countries, security commitments in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, defense budget exceeding $850 billion. The U.S. is obligated to confront threats from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Middle Eastern militia simultaneously on impossible task. Equipment is aging. Recruitment is falling. Supply chains depend on foreign rivals. This is not sustainable. Like Spain, Britain, and the USSR, America is spending beyond its strategic capacity. The dollar has been severed from gold since 1971. Since then, the money supply has expanded by over 400% since 2000. Over $6 trillion was printed between 2022. The dollar has lost 98% of its value since leaving the gold standard. Debasement today does not involve mixing copper with silver. It involves printing digital dollars at unprecedented speed. But the economic effect is exactly the same. Currency, dilution, asset bubbles, inflation, and loss of trust. U.S. national debt now exceeds $36 trillion, total 120% of GDP. With almost $1 trillion per year spent on interest alone. America is borrowing money not to invest, but to pay interest on previous borrowing. This is the textbook definition of a debt spiral. Spain defaulted. Britain was bailed out by America. The USSR ran out of real money. The United States is tracking the same trajectory. The US no longer manufactures enough to sustain its economy or its military power. 70% of critical pharmaceuticals come from abroad. 90% of computer chips are produced in Asia. Even military components depend on foreign supply chains. Like Spain, America imports what it consumes and exports dollars in return. When confidence in the dollar weakens, the consequences will be immediate and severe. No empire collapses while socially stable. Decline always comes with social fragmentation. America is experiencing profound internal deterioration. Record levels of distrust in government, rising crime and homelessness, political extremism on both sides. Declining birth rates, worsening public health, large-scale disengagement among the young. This is exactly what happened in late-stage Spain, post-imperial Britain, and late Soviet society. The United States, by every objective indicator, is in stage 5 of 7. With the United States already deep into stage 5, Only two stages remain in the historical sequence that has ended every major empire of the last 500 years. These final stages unfold faster than most expect, and once they begin, empires do not decline. Gradually they fall abruptly. No empire collapses, while the world still demands its currency. Reserve currency status is the last shield protecting a nation from financial consequences. It allows an empire to borrow cheaply, run deficits, print money, and sustain global military commitments long after its productive base has weakened. Spain lost this privilege when silver production declined. Britain lost it when the pound became overvalued and unsustainable. The Soviet Union never had it, forcing collapse even faster. Today, the US dollar still dominates global trade, finance, and commodities, but the cracks are visible. BRICS nations, developing alternative payment systems, China and Russia, trading in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia accepting non-dollar payments for oil, central banks buying record levels of gold, nations diversifying foreign reserves. Growing global concern over use and debt levels. Reserve currency loss begins slowly, then accelerates rapidly until the world no longer needs to hold the dollar. When this happens, trillions of dollars held overseas will return home, triggering rapid inflation and compounding existing debt pressure. Once reserve currency status is gone, the final stage begins. Empires do not fade away over centuries. They collapse suddenly when their structural weaknesses converge. Debt becomes unpayable. Currency loses international trust. Military commitments become unaffordable. Political institutions fail to respond. Social divisions widen beyond repair. This is a chain reaction. A currency crisis triggers a debt crisis. A debt crisis triggers a political crisis. Confidence evaporates. Markets panic. Allies distance themselves. Government institutions lose credibility. Within months, sometimes weeks, the global superpower becomes a shadow of its former self. This is how the Soviet Union collapsed in 900 days. This is how Britain lost its empire in 2 decades. This is how Spain declined after a century of mismanagement. The United States is not immune. No empire ever was. Every empire believed it was exceptional. Every empire believed it would adapt in time. Every empire believed the rules of history did not apply. They were all wrong. Maybe, but only through reforms more dramatic than anything attempted in the modern era. Restoring fiscal discipline, rebuilding domestic production, reducing military overextension, re-establishing trust in institutions, addressing internal social fragmentation, stabilizing the currency, restructuring debt before it becomes unmanageable. No empire before succeeded in reversing the pattern once it reached stage 5. But the United States has advantages they never did: technology, innovation, global networks, and unmatched cultural influence. These strengths give America a chance, but only if it recognizes the danger. History is not destiny, but patterns are warnings. And the pattern is clear. 3 superpowers: Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union followed this same sequence and collapsed. The United States is now in the same progression, already past the midpoint. The remaining stages are the most dangerous, the fastest moving, and the least forgiving. If we can understand the pattern, we can prepare for what comes next. And if America chooses to act boldly, decisively, and urgently, this story doesn't have to end the same way. But the window is closing. The math is uncompromising, and history is watching closely.